At Mind Redesign, it is our mission to help people just like you to live the life of your dreams. Whether you want better relationships, financial abundance, self confidence, your ideal body, or better performance in competition, we help our clients identify what is stopping them and we change it. Join us today, and you too can live the life of your dreams.
Hello and welcome today to the Mind Redesign teleseminar entitled Mental Preparation for Pageant Competition. Today I am thrilled to have Trisha Dampier with me. Trisha held the title of Mrs. Colorado 1989. A few years later she took over Colorado's directorship to the National Mrs. America pageant and directed that pageant for 17 years. She is the owner of Girls Speak Enterprises, a women's speaking resource, and the author of a new and fantastic book entitled Some of My Best Friends Are Beauty Queens. I asked Trisha to join me because I know of no one in the pageant industry who has more knowledge and experience regarding pageant preparation, especially when it comes to matters of bringing together the mind, body, and spirit. Trisha, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Amy, for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Well, it's all true. Trisha, I read your book, and as a pageant competitor myself, I absolutely loved it. Could you start by telling us just a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to write this book?
Well, I grew up, I like to categorize myself as one of those people who grew up, who's actually probably born with a really competitive nature. But I grew up in a time, I was born in the 50s, and I grew up in the 60s where female children were not only not encouraged to participate in sports, but there were really no opportunities, especially in team sports. There were some opportunities in track and field and volleyball at a really minimum level, but that was about it. So I grew up nurturing my competitive spirit through activities like music. I was in the band and cheerleading and pom-pom, and then ultimately through professional dance and pageantry in my adult life. So that's kind of how I got my start in this. And then the book, I can honestly say, was a dream of mine since writing a book was a dream of mine since I was little. I have documentation of when I was 10 years old telling my grandmother that I was going to write a book. And so when I retired and sold my business 2 years ago, it just seemed like the natural progression was, okay, what's next for my life? And it just seemed like the perfect timing and the perfect fit for me to write this book.
Well, as we both know, I have competed in pageantry, and you were a pageant title holder. So when we talk to people in the public who may not necessarily know much about pageant competition, they often think that it's just about the prettiest woman on stage winning the crown. And we know that's not necessarily always the case. What are some of the keys to preparing to compete in a pageant, and what makes contestants successful?
Well, and I do write about this a little bit in the book. I think the biggest misconception about pageantry or pageant competition is that it's a contest for pretty girls. And while physical attractiveness is a part of the competition, it's also a very skill-based competition, much like a sport. And so I think the approach has to be when you enter a pageant that you're actually entering a competitive sport. And so when I encourage people to do a preparation, it's really two-part. One is obviously a physical preparation that includes things like dieting and exercising and getting your body in great shape. The other part of physical preparation is walk and posture and physical self-presence. And then the second part of that is mental preparation. It's preparing yourself to give a great interview. It's preparing yourself. And in order to give a great interview, I think you have to know who you really are. So there's a lot of soul searching that goes into that process of mental preparation. I think those are the things that people from the outside looking in don't even realize about pageant competitors because, let's face it, what we really see is the end result on television. It's meant to attract a television audience, and so you don't really see all the work that goes behind or goes into becoming a title holder, but there is a lot of work, mental and physical preparation that goes into competing.
Tricia, how many contestants have competed in the Mrs. Colorado pageant during your tenure as director?
Well, we started off with a small number. My first year was in 1992. In our first pageant, I had 14 contestants, and after 1995, it was 40 and above. So I would say roughly around, over the 17 years, I worked with 750, a little over 750 women.
That's a big number. That gives you a lot of perspective, I believe, in this industry, which is why I'm so thrilled to have you here. So when it comes to mental preparation, and by that I mean being mentally confident, what are your experiences in dealing with contestants in this area?
Well, first of all, those 750 women were largely the reason I think I stayed in the career for as long as I did, 17 years. It was absolutely my passion and absolutely a joy to work with women. And some of that was just about that, was seeing people really blossom, really come into their own through the process of competing. And so I think I would get hundreds upon hundreds of calls. While 750 sounds like a lot of women, it pales in comparison to the calls that I would get every year. Hundreds and hundreds of women would call every year inquiring about entering, but there would only really be what I would consider a handful, anywhere from 30 to 50 women that would sign up to compete. And what I found over the years, as I would be talking to potential candidates or clients, that there were a couple of things that held them back, but I think for the most part, it was the fear of failure. So there were those people who would actually fear just trying, and then the second half of those people were, well, I'm willing to maybe try, but I'm really afraid of failure. So I think fear was the biggest thing, I think, that held people back from either entering or from people actually succeeding.
Mm-hmm. So my next question, I think you may have just answered that, is what do you think is the biggest mental barrier that women face in pageantry? And maybe it's fear, maybe it's not. And how did you see that play out in their lives?
Well, I think the mental barrier isn't the fear as much as it is not knowing what to do with the fear. So anytime you start a new endeavor or a new adventure or you have a new goal or a dream, certainly there's maybe some trepidation involved in that, but I think the next step to doing that, to taking care of that fear, is identifying your strengths and weaknesses, saying, okay, why do I think I can do this? What would make me good at this? What do I think potentially could hold me back? And just sort of identifying your strengths and weaknesses. And I don't think women are very good at that, and I actually write about it in the book. I think we're sometimes timid about identifying what we think is really good about ourselves and what our strengths are, because in some way it casts a light of being boastful or arrogant. And then also on the flip side, I think women don't like to identify their weaknesses because they look at them as possible roadblocks to success. So it's sort of like, well, I'll live in denial about my weaknesses, but I also don't want to seem ostentatious or boastful about what I do think my strengths are. So I think from what I gathered over all these years was, I really think that women had a hard time identifying those things, and it was sort of my mission to help them do both.
Right. So the women who actually were able to deal with the fear, and they actually were able to break through and say, you know what, I am going to compete in this competition. Do you have any examples or any stories of women in your pageant who overcame great odds to compete?
Well, it's funny that you would pose the question that way, because it seemed like the people who had the greatest challenges were really some of the most fearless people. Sometimes it was just the average woman whose fear really disabled her. I would have, I gave everybody a preparation coaching session, complimentary as part of their entry fee, and they would come into my office, and I would have these, really attractive, articulate women really express fear, like, what have I just done? I don't even know why I'm doing this, and they're so compelled to express their fear. But it was the women who had overcome really serious challenges, and I'll give you a couple of examples of them who are just really fearless. And I think maybe if you face life with real challenges, then you've faced down some of your biggest fears. But I had a contestant, maybe 5 years ago, who she called me and asked if the walk was important in pageant competition. And I said, yes, it is. And she said, well, I'm not sure I should enter because I broke my back and I walk with a limp. That was a classic example of somebody who identified that this was going to be a weakness entering the competition. And I said to her, well, I'm not going to lie to you.